Welcome to episode 5 of the Biltmore Church Podcasts. Our church exists to glorify God by making disciples of Jesus who reach up, reach in, and reach out. And this podcast is a tool that will hopefully help you do just that. We're in the middle of our 6-week teaching series about the gospel and emotional health. And so today we're going to continue that conversation. My name is Christian Cooper. I serve on staff here, and I'm here today with our lead pastor, Bruce Frank, and our very special guest, Donna Gibbs. Donna is a co-owner of Summit Wellness Centers, which provides real hope and practical help for life's hurts through the venues of professional Christian counseling, writing, speaking, and consulting. And Donna is the author of numerous book releases. Her blogs and her articles have been shared in various media outlets, and she has been featured on radio broadcasts and podcasts across America and internationally as well. And I'm not done yet. We've got more. This is so awesome. Donna's been serving individuals and families for nearly 25 years as a licensed clinical mental health counselor, supervisor, and a board-certified professional Christian counselor. That is a lot of titles. I'm really proud of myself for getting all of them. And she's a member of the American Association of Christian Counselors, a professional provider for Focus on the Family, Christian Care Network, R3 Continuum, Finding Balance, and Samaritan's Purse. And then lastly, Donna's husband, Mark, may or may not have been used in a recent sermon illustration by Pastor Bruce Frank.
Potentially.
It's a little Easter egg if you can figure it out. I'm not going to tell you which one that is. But Donna, we're so glad to have you on today for our conversation.
Yeah.
We're going to be talking about how thinking differently can improve your emotional health. And I love this idea that it's something we've been circling on this podcast for the last few weeks. I'm really excited to dive into it today. But first, Donna, you were here with us at church yesterday, and so I want to take a minute and just briefly talk about yesterday's service and sermon, talking about fear. How do we face down our fears? That was the title of the message. But I want to open up the floor here, a little bit of this idea, feeding your faith versus feeding your fear, and what some of y'all's thoughts were, whether in prep or hearing the message yesterday, just to start out.
Well, for me, it was somewhat of a revelation throughout the week because I used to, as I said at the start of the message, fear has typically kind of been one of those things. I don't think I operate in fear because I think of fear like snakes and stuff like that. But as you dug into the scriptures, fear just paralyzes and locks people down, so they either don't do what God wants them to do or just shrink back from the challenges. And so the story yesterday was very helpful out of the book of Numbers for me, because really every step is a step of faith, or at least any big challenge is going to be a step of faith. Am I going to trust God or not? And so the opposite of trusting God is just locking down in fear.
Yeah. And I didn't know what scripture you were going to be going into yesterday, and told Christian I was just so refreshed when I saw where you were going with this and how it applied to what we were going to be discussing today. And I think about Joshua and Caleb as they move forward into exploring, really not in doubt that this was the land, but is this indeed the land that God has promised? And they would have had some level of anxiety, because they would have been completely careless had they not. Every time you get up to do a sermon, you have a little bit, and it just keeps you focused, and it keeps it. But they moved forward in that. We know from the scripture later that there was some catastrophic thinking and catastrophic reports from others, and we could talk about that. But anxiety, it's just one of those things. It's never something we want to turn completely off. They would have been reckless going in to spy. But often we see, just like we did with the Israelites, that catastrophic thinking, like, here's our situation, here's our thoughts about it. Catastrophic leads you to a fight or flight, which is where they were. Right. They're like, we want to fly back to Egypt
as fast as possible.
Or if Joshua is going to keep reminding us that God is with us, then we want to stone him to death. Total fight or flight there.
Yeah, the circumstances just get bigger and bigger. And I think it was my friend Joby Martin is the first person I think I heard it say this, is like, it's not about being scared, because scared can be helpful. It's an emotion God gave us. But the idea is when God has told us to do something, walking through that, being scared in faith. Again, it's not recklessness. It's not like just picturing. It's has God given you a promise? And if you're scared about it, that's fine. I mean, honestly, Lori was really scared to leave Texas, where we were, and come to Asheville, North Carolina, where she had never even heard of before. So, but she's a person of faith, so she went past the being scared about it and didn't get locked down, and then God's blessed.
Yeah, I think there's something about like biblical courage. In order for you to exercise biblical courage, you've got to be in a situation where the natural tendency is to fear or to, like you said, being scared.
For sure.
And you push right through that. So, that Numbers 13, 14, so many great application points. One of the things I wrote down on my notes is this idea that feeding your faith requires action, but feeding your fear requires nothing. You can kind of naturally float downstream, and we talked about the promises of God and the presence of God. So just to recap for just a second, maybe someone who heard yesterday and it's already starting to escape their mind, or someone who didn't catch yesterday's sermon, application points for people, very simple, to fight fear in their everyday lives between those two, practicing the presence of God and the promises of God. What does that look like practically?
Well, I mean, for me, the whole idea of fear is you don't have to do anything to get, and I think it was Devin here on staff, he introduced me to what was doom scrolling.
Yeah.
Doom scrolling was just just going down, and it's easy to live in fear today. I mean, especially the last 2.5 years where, in my mind, with COVID, people really got almost comfortable with living in fear. And I'm not trying to indict any kind of policy thing. I'm just saying people got almost used to the emotion of living in fear, living locked down, and it's almost hard to come out of that. It's almost a comfort. You get so used to something, it's almost a comfort. It's like I like the stuff I'm more comfortable with the stuff I don't like, but I know it versus what I don't know.
Yeah.
And so in some ways that was the timing of that. But how do you feed it? It's just one of them, you're just going to get taken downstream. The other one is just the whole navigation of sanctification. How is God changing my thoughts? Because I always go back to, I know we're going to talk about it, but John 8's one is like, you'll know the truth, but you got to know the truth, and then the truth will set you free. If you don't know the truth, you can't be set free by truth you don't know. And so the idea is, what are some things, especially with the promises of God, that I can lay hold of? And it's not that hard nowadays. I mean, a 2-minute Google search, you can get 4 promises on any area of your life you want to.
That is just, it's almost, we didn't plan this, but you just put the ball on the tee perfectly for our discussion today. So before we talk about anything else, let's just dive right in. Again, we're talking about how thinking differently can improve your emotional health. So Donna, just to kick our discussion off today, big picture question, how do our thoughts affect our emotional health? In other words, why do our thoughts matter? Why do they matter?
Yeah. So the brief explanation of this, thoughts matter because literally with every thought, there's a chemical response in the brain. So when I'm speaking to groups of people, I'm like, literally, I want you to see this. There's a thought, drip. There's a thought, drip. Think of it like our thoughts are to our brains like food is to the rest of the body. It's either going to be medicinal or it's going to be toxic. And we know to be aware of that in terms of the food that we're eating. Not that we really always stick with it, but we know better. Yeah, we have that information there. But our thoughts are just harder because they're not tangible. We can't see it. We can't smell it. We can't taste it, But we have to understand that there literally is a chemical response happening in the brain with every thought. And the other piece of that, again, just really, really basic stuff, is understanding that, as we've talked about, our thoughts lead to our emotions, which then lead to our behaviors. That's a big deal because so many times we just get caught up in life. We don't even pay attention. We are most of the time not even aware of the internal narrative, but it'll seep in some other ways.
Yeah, that was you were walking into what I was going to ask, which is basically, okay, so knowing that, how does that affect, our faith, our spiritual lives? Yeah. And it sounds like it's just so interconnected.
And look, if we just go back to that scripture in Numbers, thoughts matter. The thoughts of just a few people who spied and looked into that land, thoughts are contagious because our emotions, fear is contagious. We've certainly seen that in the last few years. It's contagious. So thoughts matter on so many levels. If we're talking about our own mental health, if we're talking about our family, our church, our community, that's where it all starts.
Yeah, so I want to interrupt because I'm curious on it because I missed the marriage conference where I think you did the whole thing on this. So chemical-wise, what are a couple of chemicals? Is that where the dopamine kicks in, or is that something different? So dopamine,
serotonin, norepinephrine, dopamine, all the stuff.
That whole dopamine nation. I read The Blinkist, and I didn't get to the book yet, but that was fascinating in and of itself. Though when I click, whatever purchase or whatever, there's a chemical that kicks in. It's that high as I await, the package to be delivered. I mean, that's That's crazy. That's fascinating.
Yeah.
It is, but we've got to be able to
So,
see the unseen.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. So you've used this phrase. I heard it, I think, originally at the marriage conference, and I want to kind of ask it again here. You've talked about our thoughts being the most important conversation that no one ever heard. So can you just kind of explain that? What does that mean?
It basically just means we're all having this internal dialogue. We're all having an internal dialogue right now. It's how we are communicating together. It's how we process the world around us. It's a good thing.
Right.
And oftentimes people, they know that they're having an internal conversation. They think that they're crazy. So just validating.
Yeah.
No, you're not crazy. That is how God has orchestrated it. But because our thoughts matter, then that is the most important conversation. No one ever actually hears it. But because it leads to our emotions and our behaviors, it matters more than anything. As we talked about at the marriage conference, there is no more influential factor in a marriage than your thoughts about your spouse. There's no more influential factor in your workplace than your thoughts about your colleagues or your boss or your inadequacy or adequacy in the job that you're called to do. Your parenting. I mean, you could go into every single aspect of life. That's the most important conversation. And it's also the battleground.
Yep.
Yeah, yeah. So knowing that battleground, if it's important, help diagnose some of the negative thoughts we might have. Give some examples for me of if this internal dialogue's going on all the time, what kind of things might we be thinking that we shouldn't be or that are destructive?
Oh, yeah. So I always feel like I have the greatest opportunity. I sit on the front row seat so many times to see when someone trusts me to unpack some things in their life. The number one, bar none, most destructive thoughts is, I'm not enough.
Wow.
Just don't measure up, not good enough. And that can trickle then into, I'm not smart enough, I'm not attractive enough, I'm not young enough, I'm not old enough, I'm not whatever enough, fill in the blank enough, you know. But then we also have destructive thoughts that are connected to traumas of our past, something that's happened to us, something unthinkable. We all have a story. We all have regrets of things that we've done. We all have things that we've experienced that we've not earned that have been done to us. And the enemy takes a charge against us. And oftentimes I say we take over where that trauma left off or where that offender left off or wherever that situation left off. And here's where we take over. And we we have a self-referential statement within in that internal dialogue. I am, boom, you know.
As going back to those identity statements, it sounds like you said, I am not enough, I don't measure up. And I mean, we know what the antidote for that is. It's not you are enough. So I'm just kind of throwing a softball up there. What is the answer to that?
Right. Well, I mean, and you know, what she's talking about, the internal dialogue about other folks. So we're having an internal dialogue all the time about ourselves as well. I mean, we're thinking about that. I'm unfit for use. I'm all of this. And obviously we teach that the gospel answers that, you know, and even in the Joshua and Caleb, they weren't all talking about how awesome they were, but they were talking about, listen, God, if God's with us and we're going to go up there, if he delights in us, then guess what? This is we have to walk by faith. And so what the gospel does is, you know, talks about because of what Jesus did, and if you're in right relationship with him, you're not condemned. You're not unfit for use. You know, you're not your sin. You're not your guilt. You're not your shame. And so that's what people are like, why do you repeat about the same 5 verses all the time? And not we teach all the same 5 verses, but there's like 5 or 6 verses that I want to repeat probably at least once a month. Just, you know, 2 Corinthians 5:20 and 21. Those are ones that they're just transformative verses. You know, Galatians 2:20 probably needs to be in there. Those things, Romans 8:1 needs to be in there. Those things need to be in there because those are the strongholds. And what Donna said, it without a doubt, the battleground in the Christian life is the mind, without a doubt. Because, I mean, that's where it starts. And if the lies get entrenched in there, good or bad, whether you want to be rebellious or religious, if that gets entrenched in there, it's very hard to get out of there.
And so crucial, as you say, there's 3 to 5 of these scriptures we just want to keep reminding. And so important because we are on a rerun of the same familiar 3 to 5 destructive thoughts. We generally don't have 50 destructive thoughts. it's the replay of the
Right.
most familiar ones that we repeat over and over, and we meditate on them like watching it in a movie. Like I can play through the evidence that I'm unworthy, that I'm inadequate, or whatever,
Yep.
And so having those familiar scriptures that speak to it, that are readily available, and that speak truth back to the lie.
Yeah, Psalm 139 is another one because the whole idea is that it's been at least a whole generation. You came from animals, so you can act like an animal, and therefore you came from some cosmic material, and so what we're like Psalm 139, you were fearfully and wonderfully made. You were not a mistake. You've been made by a creator, and all those things, and that's where purpose and meaning and all that comes from. So yeah, there's. I want to know there were 3 or 5 lies that we tell, because I know the 3 to 5 truths that I try to go over and over again. Just put it, because they always fit. I mean, the gospel hits the biggest needs and soul needs, and at the soul level.
Yeah. So are those lies? I mean, are we matching up here with what the statements we're trying to tell ourselves and the lies that we're hearing? Those are we on the same page? I mean,
Everybody's different because everybody has some different soul wound or different struggle. That I am not enough is a very general, this applies to most people. But there's something specific for me, for you, for you. And God has a specific truth that addresses that uniquely for us. And we just have to be able to pause there, meditate on that truth, and feed it all the time. We can get into the specifics about what that actually means in the brain, but
yeah. So I want to tie this to what you mentioned earlier about to use a big word, I guess, the neuroscience of it, with which you were talking about all those chemicals that are taking place. So if that's kind of the way our brain is set up, and God's made us that way, which I think we're all affirming that, is it even really possible to change? Or what does that look like? What does that look like with science? There's so many different elements of this, but
yeah. So I've been at this for a long time, right?
Yeah.
So when I was in graduate school, we were taught that somebody has a stroke. Well, that's just how it is. My brother actually has just had a series of strokes. They're trying to figure out what's going on here. And so in that early days of training, the thinking is if there's a stroke, if it hits the functioning in this area of the brain, well, that's just it. Too bad. We know now that that's not the case, that the brain can adapt and develop pathways. So I'm always joking with my husband that if I-26 ever fell off the face of the planet, there's another way to get from Hendersonville to Asheville, you know? And so, but that's exactly what happens in the brain. And so while there's not a stroke that happens that addresses a destructive pathway, maybe that repeated thought that I'm not good enough that has trickled into every single area of my life and my relationships, if we're not constantly fertilizing that destructive thought, then the brain can change. We call that neuroplasticity. Big, cool word.
Yeah.
Just means the brain can change.
Yeah.
Just like God allows our brain to adapt with a scab if we've had a cut or a bruise or something, the brain can adapt.
And that takes a lot of work, I'm assuming.
We have to be willing to do the work and know that the work needs to be done.
So what would you say, I want to kind of lob another one up here, and Pastor, I'm sure you've already got some things rolling around in your head, but just scripturally, what does the Bible have to say about our thoughts to kind of tie all these things together even further? I'm thinking of just off the top of my head, I think 1 Corinthians, take every thought captive. It sounds like part of that.
2 Corinthians 10:5.
2 Corinthians, I was close. Need to write that one down. But, is there a scriptural basis for these ideas that you're kind of talking through, and what does that look like?
Yeah, I mean, I would, and I'll lob it over her like the Romans 12 part. But if you, in a bigger sense, if you take any of the statements about the word, it can be then transposed onto your thinking. Take Psalm 119. The whole thing is all about the word, about a treasure in his heart. All those things. I mean, that is doing the neuroplasticity, I guess, where the more I think about that, then guess what? I'm not thinking lies. I'm thinking truth. Obviously, the Romans 12:2 is kind of the definitive one about transformation. How do I transform that? The John chapter 8, even the Sermon on the Mount about what did Jesus do with the word and what did he, so all that being said, it's more than just when you see the word thoughts. It's really anything to do with the word and meditating on the word, Psalm 1,
Yeah.
how do you want to get blessed? Well, part of that is meditating on the word day and night and so forth and so on. So we don't use terms like meditation as much today, but that's
Right.
really what it is. It's your thoughts, because when you meditate on it, you're chewing on it and your thoughts are changing.
That's so helpful.
Yeah, the scripture that you referenced, when I think take your thoughts captive, captive is a very, very strong commanding word. That means you can't be passive to it. That's our problem with destructive thoughts. We're just passive to it. We just let it be because we can't see it. And so take it captive means arrest it. Be aggressive with it. Write it down. Label it out. And I tell people all the time, if you're not sure if you're having a destructive thought, your emotions will tell you. Because thoughts, emotions, behaviors, trace it back. If you're feeling a strong negative emotion, it's the data that I call it the check engine light. It's the data that tells you. And then write it down. What am I thinking in this moment of anxiety or anger or whatever? And then taking it captive, there's several visual things that we can do in the brain that kind of switch it. But we can't be passive to it. But the other piece I'm reminded of, what is this? Philippians 4:8. Finally, brothers, whatever is true. We'll come back to that. Whatever is honorable, whatever is just, pure, lovely, commendable, if there's any excellence, if there's anything worthy of praise, think about such things. We can't just hold something captive and then passively do nothing else. We have to replace it with truth. I have a buddy who teaches the FBI and the CIA in lie detection, and he always says, Donna, I know if I'm going in to break a case, I know that the best liars are always going to tell me the truth. They're just not going to tell me the whole truth. They're going to give me A, B, and D, and I've got to know that there's a C, and I've got to tell the rest of the story.
That is a sermon
That'll
illustration right
preach.
there. How
That
you
will
going to
preach.
take that? That is
That's what
perfect.
Joshua did. He said, but God is with us. And, if it's like telling the story of Jesus, and I'm just going to tell of his birth and his death, but not his resurrection, sometimes one single detail changes everything. And that is the case 9 times out of 10 with our destructive thoughts, because it's a battleground of the mind. There's going to be slivers of truth. That's how we get had.
Yep.
But it's just not the whole story. So whatever is true, tell the whole truth,
Yeah. Well, I think about
the hard truth.
just in numbers there. The spies come back, and no one is saying that the people in the land aren't big, right? That is true.
He was just giving data.
But that's just part of it.
Right.
And so that even that story walks into exactly what you were saying. I'm sorry to interrupt.
Yeah.
Keep going,
No.
Yeah. That's great stuff. So let's talk about changing these patterns, because it sounds like none of us are exempt from these kind of destructive thoughts. And so to kind of start talking about application, what are some things, you've hinted at them, but what are some things we can do to, number one, let's split them up into 2 categories. Number one, how do we arrest those thoughts and take them captive practically? And then number 2, we can talk about what to do from that point forward, but just starting off at the beginning.
Yeah. Well, I do think the first step is still awareness, because we have to pause. And if you're wrestling with some negative emotions, anger, sadness, bitter, anxiety, jealousy, whatever it is, let that be the check engine light that just says, pull over. You've just got to take a moment and check this out. It doesn't mean necessarily that there's anything wrong, but it means that there may be something going on, and we just need to evaluate it. But also remember, because we're so passive with our emotions, we're so passive with our thoughts, we oftentimes just let the emotions drive the car. Like, nope, it's just a check engine light. And there's a whole lot of other data indicators on your dashboard too. But that's the first step of just pausing long enough to evaluate what is going on. And then taking that thought captive, most of the time, because we're just so used to all of these thoughts rumbling through in our head, we really have to write it down and say, what am I thinking? It's the only way to dissect it appropriately, and looking for all or nothing thinking. If you notice, there's things like always or never in my thoughts, well, you've been had. Because yes, Jesus is the Son of God, but most of the things that are going on in our minds are gray, and we've turned them into all or nothing, and it's turned our mental health symptoms from here, which maybe were appropriate for the situation, up to here. But our situation's still down here. So we've got to find a way to get it turned down. And it just, I think in terms of data all the time. So write it down so you know what your data is, and you can make the adjustments accordingly. There are plenty of tricks that you can use in terms of taking the thoughts captive. I won't get into those details. But a reminder that for some people, It's just as simple as that. And then that awareness, and they can take a few strategies. For other people, they really need a Jonathan in their life. They need a buddy. They need a girlfriend. They need a mentor. They need a pastor. And some people might need a professional counselor.
Right.
And that's okay. You pick whatever level of care you need, and then do the hard work. And when I talk about the hard work of changing the brain, I mean, it really, really is hard work. People who've experienced trauma in particularly will come to me after we go through, okay, here's what you're going to have to do. And they're like, man, that first day, I battled this for 6 or 8 hours straight.
Wow.
Couldn't even function. But the next day, it's like 4 hours. And the next day, it's 2 hours. And actually, you can turn it around pretty quickly if you're just aware and you're willing to do the work. And we just have to replace it with truth. But I'm also reminded the reality that, what is Romans 12:2? Do not be conformed by the patterns of the world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. When I began to study the brain, I began looking at that scripture like nothing I've ever seen in my life. That renewal of the mind is a literal process, because the kind of work that we're talking about, where you change how you think, it literally changes pathways in the brain. The pathways look almost like a little groove, which is why I always use the sled down the hill kind of analogy, like I used at the marriage conference. It changes the brain. So you do SPECT scans of the brain before and after this kind of work that I'm talking about. And the brain looks like a different brain, which means then that if you were looking at a picture of a marriage, it would look like a different marriage, you know? It changes everything. Changes everything.
It sounds like one of those examples we talk about every now and then of kind of science catching up with the truth of Scripture there in Romans 12. I want to just quickly take a second to talk about, you mentioned like having community, those relationships. What do those conversations maybe look like? Let's say just in the context of like your marriage or a small group. How do you begin to work those things out with other people? Because a lot of this is happening inside your head.
Yes.
But you're kind of advocating for letting it leave and come out into an open space where you can talk about that.
Well, first step is just having the rhythm of community. It naturally begins to happen if you stay in the rhythm of community, and it takes some time to develop relationships and trust and to understand who can handle my stuff. You know, a relationship has to be healthy enough to handle the weight of some of the conversations that were happening. And then it's just as simple as, how are you doing? Yeah. And the boldness to say, here's how I'm doing.
Well, and the people close to you, they might not be able to read your mind, but if they're close to you, they see the fruit of it.
Yes,
I mean, especially like your spouse. I mean, if you really want to know, you can ask them, and they might not be able to tell you what the thought patterns were that got you there, but they can say, well, this triggers you here. This is a pattern that is consistently there, either fear of man or whatever it is. They can, I mean, if you have a healthy relationship with your spouse and you're not going to get defensive in 10 seconds, or a close friend, we talk about our authenticity bucket is huge, but our transparency bucket is small. Right. And that's and what Donna was talking about was those people you trust that you can handle your stuff, because everybody's got stuff. I mean, everybody's got stuff. I mean, everybody's got areas that are, we talk about, we check the sanctification box off in different orders. So we all have blind spots. It's like, all right, and it's not necessarily, going to cripple you, but everybody's got areas where, my D group, it's like they have permission. Hey, here's some things that we see, whether it be in your leadership or your whatever, and they might not be right, but they certainly are going to be at least partially right. Yeah. Enough to think about.
But how important that is, because so many times in community, we just want to pat somebody on the back and not actually tell the truth, And so when we need community, we also need people who are going to say, hey, I'm seeing you numb something. What is this with drinking a little bit more? Or what is this with this flirtatious? Or what is this? Right. And so community is not just the attaboy and the let me support you, but also let me tell you the things that maybe you don't want to hear. Sure.
Which takes time. I mean, that's why when parents always say, well, we just, especially when I talk to men, they're like, well, I took them to Disney, but they didn't see them the rest of the year. And so they're trying to, and I'm like, the chances of you having quality time driving from here to Florida are small if that's all the time you've got. Because you sometimes you can't predict when the quality time comes up. It's got to be intentional, but I mean, quality times you got to have at least some amount of quantity time. So going back to like friendships and stuff, it takes a while. I mean, just most pastors, like, we're not that trusting of people because, either we've seen people burned or been burned before. And so it takes a while to get into that trust circle where you're like, all right. And you give them little tests, just like, all right, are you trustworthy? Do I hear about this in 2 months or do I not? And so again, you want to be real with everybody. But I'd say you want to have transparency with a few trusted people that have proven trustworthy.
Absolutely. So second part, as we start to land the plane here today, let's talk briefly about, we talked about how to arrest those thoughts. And we kind of started going here, but I want to ask just very practically, how do we begin to create new pathways? You talked about the sledding thing and how we kind of stop that pathway from continuing. Let's talk about how we can create new pathways over time.
Okay. I can do the analogy if you got.
I love a good analogy.
We'll do the analogy. So I always think, when I think about pathways in the brain, I always think about a sled going down a snow-covered mountain. Because when you think about it, the first time that you go down the path, you have to forge your way down a little bit. Like you might break a sweat. It's like it's stubborn, and you have to work at it. You might even have to get somebody in the sled with you. But what happens is the more that you do that, the faster you go, the further you go, and suddenly you've got a path. And eventually you're going to get to the place where all you've got to do is put the sled at the top of the hill, and you just better hold on because it's going, right? So that is how our pathways work. And that's whether we have a toxic pathway or a healthy pathway. But for many of us, what we're talking about, we've got destructive pathways. And for many people listening, they've just now noticed, oh my word, I am one of those. I've got that destructive pathway. Right. So here's the hope and here's the next step. We just have to pick up the sled. And we're going to do it the exact same way that it happened the last time, but we're going to do it on purpose this time. And so just know that you're going to have to forge the path and you're going to have to work at it. And that destructive thought is going to keep coming back because it's a pathway. Of course it is. No shame in that. Don't beat yourself up for it. Just know, oh, there it is again. I've got to take it captive again. I've got to work at it again. And repetition and meditation is how you got there. Repetition and meditation is how you get out. And we develop a new pathway. And it then becomes the automatic thought. And the beautiful way of how the brain adapts to that is that if we are not constantly fertilizing a thought, it's going to go back into the background some. It's the reason, like the marriage retreat, I always start off by singing a song, some 1980s song that hopefully we have not been listening to every day. But there it is.
It's in there.
Just like we can ride a bike. We have not been on it in 10 years, and it might be a little rusty, but we can bring it back. But it's not there intruding in our life every day. Whitney Houston is not singing in my head. Well, it is for everybody now.
No, it is now.
No, it is. But only because we bring it back up.
Now that would be for good or bad, correct?
Yes.
So if you fertilize the good, it's going to be more and more. But if you don't, it's going to kind of get back in the background, right?
Exactly. And so if people are listening right now and they're wrestling with mental health symptoms and they know, I've got some of those destructive thoughts, well, you can keep them there. You just keep fertilizing them. Keep doing what you're doing, and this is what we get.
Yeah.
And honestly, sometimes, a few weeks or months ago, you preached on when Jesus asked the question, do you want to be healed? That is such a legitimate question for us to continue to be asking because it really can feel terrifying. If you've been wrestling with some of these mental health symptoms, do you want to be healed? It's scary. If I've been in a pit of depression or anxiety or trauma, what does it mean for me to be out of it? And so picking up a sled, that sounds scarier than just what I described it to be.
Yeah. Well, and I was thinking about what you said about, those destructive thoughts are still, occasionally they're going to pop up even as you're working on it. But that is a chance, at least what I'm hearing is that is a chance to once again fix my eyes on Jesus and allow the Holy Spirit to work through that. So maybe there's a little bit of like, oh man, I'm thinking that way again. Yeah. That just drives me right back into that dependence.
And I always say, just think of that as a temptation now. That's all that is. It's like saying, I saw somebody's wallet. It probably has a $20 bill in it. Am I going to get that? No, where did that thought come from? You know, so let's just treat that old destructive thought like a temptation. Don't give it any more credibility than that. Let's just keep moving. And just know by faith and now by science that the brain is going to change. And I hear testimonies of so many people who say, seriously, I don't feel like I have the same brain anymore. And I'm like, you don't. You do not.
Yeah.
When it doesn't happen overnight, it happens over time, I think is what you're saying. It's going to take an overtime, because if that voice has been there for a long time, it's gonna take a little time to replace that. You're trying to turn the volume up on what's true, which is going to replace that I always fall at this place, or we always go down this spiral when we get to this place as a couple, whatever that is. It's going to take a while. But you got to do what you don't want to do to get where you want to get.
Yeah. But the rhythm, if you're aggressive at it, it doesn't have to take nearly as long as you might think. You know?
That's good.
And there's so much hope in that.
Well, I'm thinking just, again, the cherry on top there is, hey, with man, impossible. With God, possible.
Right.
With God. And then, like you said yesterday, a little bit of faith, big God, and a little bit of time. I think many people who are listening today are going to be able to find that those things are true in their own lives. So thank you so much. I have learned a ton. I should have taken notes while we were talking. I'm going to have to go back and listen to this and take some good notes. Thank you both so much for jumping on our conversation today. I know this is just a start, and you could talk about this for hours and hours and hours and hours, but I do think this is going to be a great starting point for our people. So if you're listening today, I want to encourage you to really begin to put some of these things into practice. This is not just information for you to have information. This is information for you to put into practice and begin to exercise faith in some of these areas. So before we wrap up today, I want to remind you of two things. Number one, we're covering a lot of ground, and we've got a lot of great questions that have come in over the last few weeks. We've covered some of those. Some of them we've just kind of weaved into our conversations naturally. But I want to encourage you to keep submitting those questions. We've got an email set up at podcast@biltmorechurch.com, and we're hopefully going to be discussing some of those as we go, as we continue this journey. And we've also got a website set up with all types of resources, including a link to the Summit Wellness Center's website, which has even more additional resourcing on it. So you can get so much from that. Let me encourage you to go check that out. But you can go to canwetalkaboutit.com, and you're going to find all that stuff on there, as well as a bunch of other recommended resources and resources we've put together. But we're on this journey together, so I hope you've been encouraged today. I hope you've been strengthened in your walk with Jesus. And we've been doing this a few weeks. So, Donna, it's your turn. Do you know how we close the podcast? You go to church at Biltmore Church, so I think you might have a guess.
You are loved and you are sent.
You're loved and sent.